So anyway, I'm very honoured to open this today. I feel I've got a bit of imposter syndrome here because we're in the presence of Randolph here, who is the founding father, in my view, of the field. So I'm going to be sort of talking about his work and others too. But without him, I think the field would be, back in 1962 with, the odd paper here and there. And I just want to thank you so much for giving us so much inspiration to run all these things and do these things. Right, so can I just ask for another show of hands? How many of you are unfamiliar? I put it in the negative, I probably shouldn't have done, but how many of you are unfamiliar with evolution and psychiatry? So you're all familiar with the idea. I mean, I thought you probably would be. How many of you have studied or read papers? Is that everybody? Just about everybody, because you probably wouldn't be here otherwise. But here's the crucial question. How many of you teach evolution and psychiatry in your... So that's again about quarter. So those are my first questions for the beginning of the meeting. We won't talk about these. This is really for the end, not just of my talk, but the end of the meeting. How should we go about disseminating the ideas, and how can we get it into either medical or psychiatric education? But I think that's probably the agenda for the whole meeting. So, some basic questions. What is evolutionary psychiatry? How do we go about it? And very importantly, again, this will not be solved here, but how do we test our hypotheses? So, what is evolutionary psychiatry? Well, I personally wish it was called evolution and psychiatry, because it's not a fringe alternative medicine, but it's basically applying Darwinian and natural selection principles to why we are vulnerable to certain conditions. And that begs a lot of questions like, what is a disease, a condition, a disorder, a syndrome, a phenotype? And that has been the subject matter of a lot of, well, heated, but I suppose complex discussions that we've had. What should we be looking at? And it hasn't been solved by psychiatry, but we think we've got some better questions. And I was saying to Randy last night, I don't think we have all the answers. We're not claiming to have all the answers. We're not even claiming to have all the questions that is necessary to solve the problems in psychiatry. But I think we have a range of questions which are extremely interesting and can open up certain aspects of psychiatry which have been controversial and closed for decades, causing a rift between what we call the ultra-biological psychiatrists and the anti-psychiatrists. And I think we have some rapprochement of understanding where they come from, but saying, look, here is a model that helps deal with some of these issues. Anyway, so using the ideas from natural selection and really neo-Darwinism, because we obviously look at genes and Mendel, and of course we look a lot further than that into post-neo-Darwinist evolutionary theory, but basically taking the I suppose it would be the Fisherian idea and the Dawkinsonian idea, but modified. Now, if you really want to read a decent article on what is evolutionary psychiatry, what it's all about, it's quite a long paper. How many words was it, Randy?
Too many, way too many.
Absolutely fabulous. It isn't a 10-minute read, though. It's not a book, it's not a chapter, but it's fabulous read. And you could do well if this was the first thing you were going to read this, because it covers all the issues, although I think you yourself called it slightly telegraphic, because there is now so much that you can't cover every issue, even in a long paper. Now, I was interested in evolution at A-level in the 1960s. So I've been doing medicine for over 50 years now. And I've as a consultant psychiatrist for nearly 30 years. In the 1990s, oh, wrong one, go back. I read this book. I was always interested in evolution, but evolution and psychiatry were rather poles apart. There's the odd paper, as I say, there was bits by, was it Tim Crow on schizophrenia and language, and there was Mayer and things like this. Then I read this book, and the chapter, Are Psychiatric Disorders Diseases, suddenly lit up my interest. And then, as a result of that, we invited Randy over to a Royal Society of Medicine conference in London. And believe it or not, Riyadh and his co-author, Mohammed, was sitting in the row in front of me, and I'd read their papers. And then what happened was I introduced myself, and Riyadh and I got together. Well, we spoke most mornings on the telephone whilst in traffic going to work. And we started the Evolutionary Psychiatry Special Interest Group by hook or by crook, by a whole load of means whilst we were working for trusts. And the rest is history. We've got the group, and we formed close relationships with our colleagues, many of whom are here. And that's as a result of reading this book. And then we got other books which are equally informative. Now, I'd recommend reading this one first, although it is, what is it? It's 32 years old now. The second one I read was the Alfonso, the Michael Maguire and Alfonso. Very good. The Anthony Stevens and John Price book was very interesting. It's chapters on paraphilias, sexual disorders, I think is some of the best written. But it was, in a polite way, perhaps a little too Jungian for my taste. It was not quite, I think Riyadh slightly upset John by saying it was a bit too analytical rather than scientific, psychoanalytical, I mean. And then this is the next book I read. Well, actually, this is the second edition, as you might note there. That's Martin Bruner's book. And I'd certainly read, if you want a good read all of those. And then, of course, conflict of interest here. Riyadh and I, well, during lockdown, we didn't know quite what to do with ourselves. We'd doing consultations on the telephone and, assessing people. And we got all those authors, except Jonathan Price, who sadly has passed away. We got all the major authors of all those books together, and others, leaders in the field. And I noticed quite a few here, Nikhil, Annie, and so on. And we put together a sort of compendium of people that we knew. It was basically our contacts. And we did it over the internet whilst we were all in lockdown and so on and so forth. And I think it's got quite a good introduction of what evolutionary psychiatry is. So I can't really tell you what evolutionary psychiatry is in detail, but I can say where to find it. And it's also got the individual chapters on some of the disorders, but there are notable gaps because we couldn't find experts in everything, and we didn't have the time or the contacts to do that. And then, of course, there's Randy's. What year was that published, Randy? That was 22?
2019.
Was it that long ago? Gosh, time flies. Another absolutely marvellous book that's certainly worth reading, especially if you're interested in depression and anxiety and things. But it covers lots of other areas as well. So why are we interested in evolution? Well, for me, it helped fill the gap between, as I say, the anti-psychiatry saying everything's social. It's just problems with living. It's not medical at all. We shouldn't be involved with it. Doctors, should all be social care or psychotherapy. I'm not saying that social care and psychotherapy aren't important, but compared with the doctors that just see it as broken brain, take this tablet. And there's room in different circumstances for each. And it began to put the connections between these things together, insofar as we were saying, why do people have these genes, or why is it that you need to treat with an antidepressant when somebody's had a bereavement or divorce, and when should you do it? What are the criteria? When do you decide it's natural or not natural? These are really difficult questions. And, well, I think I'll let you read it. It explains itself. This is important. And we'll probably hear why later. I won't get into the talk in itself about whether adaptations are diseases and whether diseases are adaptations. These are very unlikely, and these are errors of thinking. And we have to look at things as vulnerability or other ways of looking at it. But that's oversimplified. So we have to think about very carefully what we're saying and why we're saying it. So what are the problems of current mainstream psychiatry? I've touched on them. Certainly the biological psychiatrist looking at everything caused by serotonin or dopamine or whatever, or even just developmentally. This is an important understanding. Confounding distress with disease, and the D's, distress, disease, dysfunction, disorder, disability. It's quite philosophical. I mean, I would say that evolution and psychiatry is as much a philosophy, and I don't mean that in a rude way. It's a philosophy, it's a perspective of looking at the data as much as it is a prospective science. Now, we're hoping to make it more prospective empirical science, but you have to start off with a philosophy of what you think you're looking at and why. And we're talking about, the excessive reductionism, looking at why are you depressed, well, a low serotonin, or whatever the theory is. That's great, but it doesn't explain what's going on. And why have we got genes for serotonin? Why is serotonin doing what it does? What does it do? And if you have a divorce, do you really explain why somebody's miserable by saying their serotonin dropped? The mechanism is not necessarily the same thing as the cause, and we need to think very carefully about that. And this is especially important for trainees. The bewildering array of not only models but just information. We were saying about this morning with, where's Nicole? I've lost her. Oh, you're over there. We were saying about the fact that we can't get this onto training schemes because the professors and so on and so forth and the administrators sort of say, oh, there's far too much for doctors to learn. Yes, we agree there is, but they're learning disconnected facts. And my contention is that learning some evolution can bring these facts together to make much more sense of them so they actually fit together rather than just be disconnected stuff you've got to learn for membership, MRC cycle or whatever. And I mean, there are trainees here which will probably say whether it's helped them learn and understand things so that they can explain things either in examinations or, more's the point, to patients and relatives, etc. And I think that's one of the great strengths. So just to quickly, I mean, I presume all of you, as we don't have many neophytes here to evolution, know the Tinbergen diagrams. And this is really a schematic representation of what is important about understanding Darwinian processes in terms of behaviour and genes and bringing in development, as well as mechanisms. We're not denying mechanisms, that would be silly. But to explain how they interact and why this is important. And of course, we're saying that from an evolutionary perspective, we're adding this side rather than what has been going on in psychiatry without really understanding the interaction at this level. So in other words, if you read a book on genes, the number of times evolution, you'd think evolution would be mentioned. Why do you have these alleles? What are the genes for at an evolutionary level? And most of the psychiatric textbooks, the genetics chapter is just about what genes do what, and it's absolutely rigidly mechanistic. So this is another way of putting down Tim Bergen's 4 questions. And we're talking about not only the phylogeny, what is the history of any trait, but how's it influenced fitness, which is very important on and beyond what we're talking about in psychiatry and human beings, which is where most of the work has been done to date. Now, I say there's 9 pathways. I'm not going to get into a discussion with Rand because sometimes it's 6, sometimes it's 9, sometimes... I think you got up to 16, did you say once?
Yes.
Yeah, but they're actually, depends how, it's whether you're a lumper or a splitter, they actually are sort of connected. You could subdivide them or clump them together. And there's a number. And these, again, each one of these could be an individual talk this morning. And I think the important ones for us today are mismatch, or otherwise known as genome lag, excessive defense mechanisms when we're talking about anxiety or depression, but it applies to general medicine as well, and I'll show a slide later. And the other considerations, less important about losing arms race against pathogens. I mean, we saw that with the COVID, where actually evolution got on television a few times with virology, but it kept saying a new strain has emerged. No, it has emerged, but it's also evolved. It's got to emerge first, yeah, sure. But the reason it took over was evolutionary. Constraints, again, very important. Sexual selection, and I think there's a lot of psychiatry where this is quite important. And then other things in terms of the genetics and bottlenecks, things like Huntington's in certain populations, and also selection favouring reproductive success at the expense of health, which explains a lot of misery and why people do, well, we could say they're daft things, but they sabotage their marriage or job opportunities or whatever for sexual reasons. And it's worth trying to understand these things. So these are the sort of areas that we hope to look at. So what do we propose? Well, we propose that natural selection has something to do with who we are, not just development. Our human brains didn't just come out of, a sort of tacit creationism. They were just created, you know. And what does this mean? So it means that we have naturally selected important functions, that we have various mechanisms which have been selected, that there are mental conditions that interfere with these mechanisms, and that's one way of looking at what is a disorder. But we also look at, in evolutionary psychiatry, not just things that harm the person, but we look at, it gets very complicated because we're going over to Jerome Wakefield's idea of harmful dysfunction. It's not just a dysfunction, it's got to harm someone somewhere. So if you have something which reduces, for instance, reproduction, you could say that's a harm, but you could say that the contraceptive pill is therefore harmful because it's reducing fertility. 5 minutes left. Right. So I was talking about defense mechanisms being excessive. Again, this is Randy's work. Very important. This is worth learning about. And I do feel I'm preaching to the choir here because most of you will know all this stuff. But of course, there are some newcomers here that haven't covered these areas, which is why I'm introducing what are the areas we cover. And how do we do it? Well, at the moment, there's very little double-blind controlled trials in evolution and psychiatry. We haven't got the funding, we haven't got the worldwide acceptance for the funding bodies. But we have a lot of information which I call retrospective, which is different from data dredging. And we do retrodictions. We say, what should we see in the epidemiological data if such and such was true? And then we look at the data. And this is why it's different to just so stories. But we have to be rigorously scientific. But what we need to do is we need to move forward from the retrodictions and looking at other people's data to making our own. But we do things from all these different fields, whether it's, we've got anthropologists here, I see Nikhil in the front row, and we've got philosophers, which, well, I'm not sure whether Adam regards himself still as a philosopher, but he started off that way. And we've got lots of doctors and psychologists and so on. So we use all these fields in their own way to help bring together the data. But what we don't have is a TARDIS. So we can't go back and actually do experiments on the human genome from 70,000 years or before. So what do we actually do? Well, this is basic science. How do you do? Go back. Randy, you're modifying this. I don't know, are you talking at the full conference on this? Yeah. So those of you that are going to be at the full conference, we've been discussing, arguing in an intellectual sense about how to go about this. It's not resolved, but it'll use basic scientific methodology, but how to formulate the hypotheses so they're testable. Very important as a way forward. And here, I won't go into this. Again, this is the philosophy of science. How do we go about this? And we're at this stage at the moment, the hypothetico-deductive, and we need to be going into the falsifiability. Mentioned Wakefield's work, very important for clinicians. We're not just saying that disorders like, taking the contraceptive pill, which reduces fertility, is harmful to the individual de facto, because if you can't have children, you're ill, or something like that. We're not guardians of the genome either. We're not here to do eugenics, and that's a very important thing. As mentioned earlier, we're talking about shaping vulnerability, not shaping disorders directly. Why evolution is not better known and taught more. Again, this is a whole talk, a whole discussion, a whole day, a whole conference by itself. And it's not all religious fanatics that are creationists. There's a huge amount of inertia amongst our colleagues. And even the ones that say, oh yeah, that's interesting, they just leave it at that. And, oh, fine. So we need to actually deal with why this is happening. I find trainees are much more open to evolution, and they see the opportunities far better than our dyed-in-the-wool colleagues. I mentioned values. We're not eugenicists. We're not here. We're here to be healers of the distressed, not guardians of or watchdogs of biological adaptation, or as in eugenics, cultural preferences. And so, we need to be very careful that we're not misunderstood. And I'll leave it at that point.
Oh, great. So we're right on time then. Thank you very much for that.
Thank you.